Welcome to the course Critical Thinking Skills in Science. This is Chapter 5, Man's Origin, Session 3. Again, we're Tim and Holly, and if you'd like to communicate with us, the addresses are there. What we're looking at is the origin of man, the origin of thinking, but we're looking at it from a non-Western biblical, with the source of reliable knowledge being Scripture. But we're starting with a quote by Nina Jablonski, an anthropologist and paleobiologist at the Pennsylvania State University. What does she have to say? She says, "It's true that we do routinely identify each other's race as black, white, or Asian based on visual cues. But crucially, those are values that humans have chosen to ascribe to each other or themselves. The problem occurs when we conflate the social habit with scientific truth, because there is nothing in the individual genomes that could be used to separate them along such clear racial lines. In short, variations in human appearances don't equate to genetic differences. Races were created by naturalists and philosophers of the 18th century. They are not naturally occurring groups," Jablonski emphasized. So in other words, the question in the session previous was that we're all descended from one blood. We're all descended from one couple. And if that be true of Adam and Eve, then where do we get all the races from? And what this scientist has just said is that the races were created by naturalists and philosophers of the 18th century. There is no genetic differences to delineate between races. There's more genetic differences between those within one race than there are between races. So in other words, we can have a couple that provide the genetic information to have been isolated into different groups of people, which in the 18th, 19th century, the natural philosophers named them races and categorized them by color, by skin tone. And what this professor is saying is that that is a social construct. It does not hold any scientific truth. So we can still believe, yes, that Adam and Eve were created and that everyone descended from one couple, because the difference between us is not clean dividing lines of races, but it is pigmentation of the skin, which is a genetic variation, but not a genetic difference. There are not difference as in even a difference of quality, saying between the different tones, skin tones. So we can believe in one couple beginning the human race as created by God, because even today the science does not recognize the division of races and that we're all one blood. But then there's another issue. Genesis chapter 11 verse 2. "The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. As they traveled east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they lived there." They said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top reaches to the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad on the surface of the whole earth." Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had built. Genesis chapter 11, 6 and 7 says, Yahweh said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing will be withheld from them, which they intend to do. Come, let's go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Genesis 11, 8 and 9. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from there on the surface of the earth. They stopped building the city. Therefore the name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of all the earth. From there Yahweh scattered them abroad on the surface of all the earth. So we have one couple that scientifically could have produced still all the races today, because the term race is a social construct, not a scientific proof. Then we have languages. We have an event here that says that man wanted to make a name for himself, and so man built a city. He came together and he started building a tower unto the heavens. God looked at it and said, these people are going to be able to accomplish whatever they put their mind to if I don't go down there and at least scatter them according to languages. Give them a different language. And that sounds kind of, well, it's a miracle. Did that really happen? I mean, can God do that? Well, yes, of course. If God is God, he can do that. And if he has access to the system, then yes, he can do that. But there's other things that are just remarkable about that whole event. Here's a quote that just says, while an evolutionary worldview might expect all languages to trace back to a single parent language, that isn't what researchers have found. Instead, language families of today trace back to multiple unrelated parent languages. Exactly what we would predict from the Babel account. So it's, where did all the races come from? One, there aren't races. There are genetic differences, but not in quality. It's in tones. It's the same genes, but with different tonal effects. So man is still of one race, one blood. Okay, so how about then his languages? No, it's true, is that there are a lot of languages. Where did they all come from? Well, if the evolutionary perspective, worldview, be true, then you would expect language to have began at one point, and that all the other languages have branched off from that original trunk. So you would have a trunk of man, of human beings developing language first time, and then from there the branching off of different language groups, but reducing each group down to its relational parent, and reducing all the parents down to one, or origin. But that's not what happens. What happens is that they can reduce the language groups down. There's many groups today that exist that are related, but relating them or reducing them down, we get down to certain families of languages that cannot be reduced, and they are not related. They are separate groups. And I say, well, okay, then that's what maybe the biblical model would predict, because in the Tower of Babel, they weren't all learning a language and branching out. They were all given a language that was distinct from many. How many language groups were then given out at Tower of Babel? I don't know, but I would say probably the major language groups that exist today, the parent groups, are the ones that were divided or given out to divide man at the Tower of Babel. So those are two concepts to consider. One is the race concept. If we all came from Adam and Eve, then where'd all the races come from? And that would be solved by saying, well, the scriptures teach that we are all one blood, and so it doesn't recognize races. And now this scientist explains races are a social construct, not a scientific truth. And that social construct was built based on the evolutionary philosophers of the 18th century. So what about languages? Well, languages cannot be traced either back to one single group. They're traced back to various groups that existed parallel or side by side, and they aren't related. So how can that be explained? Well, it can be explained by the Tower of Babel event, if you allow an open system of a creator that can exercise his will. This is session 3. We're on chapter 5, Man's Origin, Critical Thinking Skills in Science. Thank you again for joining me.